He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, "Do more." And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
There's a particular kind of television magic that only reveals itself once the show is gone. While it is airing, you see the costumes and the sets and the dialogue. You see the robot waving its arms and hear the warning sirens and watch a family navigate the impossible together. What you never see is what is happening just beyond the edge of the frame. The arguments in dressing rooms, the overnight rewrites slid under doors, the performer climbing into a 200-pound metal suit every morning, knowing it might knock him unconscious by afternoon. The leading man sitting in a folding chair at the back of the soundstage, listening to classical music, because there's nothing else for him to do. Lost in Space ran for 3 seasons and 83 episodes on CBS between 1965 and 1968. It was one of the most watched shows in America during its peak years. Merchandise flew off shelves. Fan mail arrived by the sackful. And then, without ceremony, without warning, and without so much as a proper goodbye from the network that had profited enormously from it, the show simply stopped. The people who had given those 3 years of their lives found out the way you find out about weather. One morning the newspaper told them it was over. What those people carried with them afterward, and what they finally began saying in the closing chapters of their lives, reveals a story that the original audience never had access to. Not because anyone deliberately concealed it, but because the television industry of that era ran on a particular kind of silence. You did not speak candidly about your employer. You did not admit that the production you were part of was held together by personal rivalries and physical danger, and one extraordinary actor who had decided, entirely on his own initiative, that he was simply not going to accept the role as written. The cameras rolled, the episode aired, and the machinery of weekly entertainment ground forward. The real story waited. Now, across interviews and memoirs and reunion appearances spanning 6 decades, it has finally come out. And it is considerably more fascinating than anything the Robinson family ever encountered out among the stars. The show was built on a foundation that was actually thrown away before filming ever properly began. In late 1964, producer Irwin Allen completed a 60-minute pilot film called No Place to Hide that represented, by any reasonable measure, the most serious and ambitious science fiction television had attempted in America up to that point. The budget was staggering for its era. The technical team was genuinely distinguished. The story was clean and unsentimental. A family of exceptional intelligence sets out for a distant star system, is knocked off course, and must survive on an alien world using nothing but their own ingenuity and their trust in each other. There was no villain. There was no comedy. There was no robot. There was a boy sitting around a campfire singing an old English folk song while the stars burned overhead. And the whole thing had the texture of something that wanted to be taken seriously. CBS executives watched the pilot and did something Allen had not prepared for. They laughed with pleasure. They bought the series on the spot, and then they handed Allen a list of requirements that would fundamentally transform what the show was. They wanted a recurring antagonist. They wanted a mechanical character who could serve as a kind of anchor for the younger audience. They wanted, in short, a show that could be sold the same way every week, without demanding too much investment from viewers who might be tuning in after dinner on a weeknight and not feeling particularly adventurous. Allen pushed back where he could, but the network held the money, and the network got what it wanted. The original pilot footage was not discarded. It was carefully cut apart and distributed across the first 5 episodes of the series. A saboteur and a robot were written into the surrounding scenes, their absence from the original footage explained by the convenient narrative device of having them remain behind at the ship. The serious survival drama that Allen had believed in enough to spend $600,000 filming was preserved only as connective tissue inside a different show entirely. The man inserted into those early episodes as the show's antagonist was Jonathan Harris, and what he proceeded to do over the following 3 years is one of the more audacious acts of creative self-preservation in television history. Harris had grown up in the Bronx, the son of Russian immigrant parents, and had remade himself so completely and so deliberately that the polished, theatrical presence he brought to every set bore almost no resemblance to the boy he had started as. He had changed his surname as a teenager, earned a pharmacy degree he never intended to use, constructed a performing career through a combination of genuine talent and absolute determination, and arrived on the Lost in Space set as an actor who had appeared on Broadway and in The Twilight Zone and who understood, with complete clarity, what the character of Dr. Smith as originally written represented. It represented a brief engagement and an early exit. Smith was designed to be eliminated within the first 5 episodes. He was a spy and a saboteur, cold-blooded and functional, a plot device more than a character. Harris looked at this blueprint and began quietly, methodically, and entirely without authorization, constructing something else on top of it. He arrived at rehearsals with pages of new dialogue he had written overnight. He would gather the cast and announce with perfect composure that they were going to run the scene using his version, not the script's version. He engineered the physical staging of scenes so that the camera's eye was consistently drawn back to Smith. He invented an entire psychological architecture for the character, reframing Smith not as a cold villain, but as an elaborate, theatrical coward whose grandiosity was a survival mechanism and whose bombast was, when you examined it closely, genuinely funny. The insults he constructed for Smith to hurl at the robot were not in any script ever submitted to the production. Harris sat up at night with a pen and a notepad and invented phrases that had the rhythm and absurdity of genuine comic poetry. He understood that Smith needed the robot as a sparring partner because the robot was the only character shrewd enough to see through Smith's pretensions, and Smith had to attack constantly to keep that shrewdness from becoming a problem. Every thundering insult, every melodramatic complaint about his delicate back, every eye roll delivered with the precision of a man who had spent decades studying how an audience responds to visible human weakness, was a calculated choice. Harris was not improvising. He was composing. By the time Irwin Allen fully recognized what had happened, the audience had already made the decision for him. Fan letters were arriving specifically addressed to Dr. Smith at a rate that dwarfed the correspondence for any other character. Children were imitating his phrases in school playgrounds. The character designed to disappear in 5 weeks had become the reason people tuned in. Allen later acknowledged this transformation publicly, and with what appeared to be genuine admiration, describing how Harris had essentially dictated the direction of the character through the sheer force of the audience response he had generated. What Allen said somewhat less publicly was that this success had come at a significant cost to the person originally intended to anchor the show. Guy Williams arrived on the Lost in Space set as a genuine star. His 4 years playing Zorro for Disney had made him recognizable and beloved across America, and the show's early promotional materials positioned him exactly as you would expect. The commanding father, the brilliant scientist, the man whose judgment and courage would carry his family through the unknown. Williams had been fencing since he was a child. He was physically striking and genuinely enthusiastic about the role. The first season gave him material worthy of that enthusiasm, and the merchandise generated in the show's early months suggested that the network's confidence in him as an anchor had been well placed. Then the gravity of the Dr. Smith phenomenon began its slow, steady pull. Screen time shifted. Episode structures reorganized themselves around the comedy of Smith's schemes and the robot's weary responses to them. Williams found himself delivering a handful of lines per episode and then watching from the edges while his co-stars carried the story forward. His castmates later described the atmosphere on set during those middle and final seasons with a candor that was only possible once enough time had passed. The resentment was real. The frustration was professional and personal simultaneously. Williams was a man who had come to the show in good faith, expecting to lead it, and had watched the floor shift beneath him through no failure of his own. Harris himself acknowledged this directly, calling it genuinely difficult for any actor to endure, which was a notably honest assessment from the person most responsible for the difficulty. Williams filled his waiting hours with the resources of a curious and restless mind. He read widely, listened to music, studied chess, and managed investments with enough skill that his financial situation remained solid long after the show ended. His castmates remembered him with real affection even as they acknowledged the complicated emotional weather he carried through those final seasons. the nickname given to him by one of his younger co-stars, referring to his habit of meticulous self-grooming between takes, was offered with warmth rather than mockery. It was the portrait of a man channeling his frustration into anything that kept him occupied and away from the version of himself that might have expressed it less constructively. After cancellation, Williams found that Hollywood had moved on in the way Hollywood moves on, which is to say completely and without ceremony. The work dried up. He relocated, eventually settling in Argentina, where Zorro had achieved the status of a genuine cultural institution. The reception he received there was so dramatically different from his experience in America that it constituted a kind of alternative ending to a career that had seemed to stall. The Argentine government provided him with comfortable accommodations. The wife of a sitting president invited him to perform at state events. He was recognized everywhere and treated with the warmth of a country that had grown up with his image and had not forgotten what it meant to them. He spent more than 2 decades living that life on the other side of the world, and when he died in May of 1989, he was discovered alone in his Buenos Aires apartment after friends had gone several days without hearing from him. The interval between his death and its discovery was approximately a week. He had been living without the kind of daily human contact that would have made his absence immediately apparent, in an era before the technology existed to close those distances instantly. The man who was supposed to lead the most prominent science fiction family on American television died undiscovered and alone, in a country that valued him enormously, while the country that had employed him had largely forgotten he existed. The person whose physical suffering during the production was most completely invisible to the audience was a man the audience never saw at all. Bob May had not come to the Lost in Space audition with any particular intention of landing the role he landed. He was at the studio for an unrelated purpose when Alan's team redirected him to try on the robot suit. The audition had no artistic component. It was purely physiological. If the suit fit and the performer could move inside it plausibly, the job was his. May climbed in, made it through the session, climbed back out, and discovered he was bleeding from places where the metal interior had made contact with his skin. He accepted the role. The suit weighed roughly 200 pounds. The studio lights that were necessary for filming raised the temperature inside the costume to levels that would have been considered a workplace hazard in almost any other context. May later described the experience of working inside it as something between a sauna and a slow endurance test. On at least 2 occasions during the production run, he lost consciousness inside the suit and had to be extracted by crew members who only realized something was wrong when the robot stopped moving. The production's response to these incidents was to continue filming. There was a schedule. There was a budget. The show had to go on, and the man inside the robot was a logistical consideration rather than a human being whose safety required accommodation. May was never credited on screen during the original run of the series. Not once, across all 3 seasons and all 83 episodes, did his name appear in the credits of the show his physical performance had helped make beloved. This had practical consequences beyond the absence of recognition. Credit structures in the television industry of that era were directly tied to residual payments and the financial rewards that accumulate when a show enters syndication and generates ongoing licensing income. May and his wife lived modestly for decades, in circumstances that bore no relationship to the global affection that the character he had inhabited continued to generate. In 2008, a wildfire destroyed their home. 2 months after that loss, May died of heart failure. What distinguished his public life in his later years was a quality that could only be described as a deliberate inversion of the invisibility that had been imposed on him professionally. At science fiction conventions, where aging stars of beloved properties gather to meet the fans who grew up with their work, May became legendary for his patience and his generosity. He would remain at signing tables until every single person who wanted a moment with him had received it, regardless of how long it took. He explained this in terms that were straightforward and without self-pity. No fan who had come to see him was going to be turned away or made to feel that their affection was an inconvenience. A man who had spent 3 years being made invisible inside a machine chose, in the portion of his life when he could make his own decisions, to make sure that no one who sought him out ever felt invisible in return. The end of the show itself was handled with a carelessness that the cast members, who survived long enough to speak about it freely, described, with a mixture of resignation and disbelief. CBS offered a fourth season conditional on a budget reduction. Allen declined. The network announced cancellation in February of 1968. June Lockhart, who had played the Robinson family's mother, with a warmth and intelligence that anchored the show's emotional center across all 3 seasons, learned about it from a small item in the entertainment section of her morning newspaper. There was no call from the network. There was no meeting with a producer. There was no acknowledgement that 3 years of sustained work from a full cast and crew had just been terminated. The newspaper told her, and that was the entirety of the farewell CBS had prepared. The final episode left the Robinson family stranded exactly where they had always been, still searching, still not home, entirely unaware that there was no next week coming. No finale was written or filmed because the production did not know it needed one. The show simply stopped mid-journey. The way a sentence stops when someone puts down a pen in the middle of a word and walks out of the room. What happened to the people involved over the following decades resists any simple narrative of bitterness or recovery, because neither of those words quite captures what actually occurred. Harris continued working with the energy and precision of a man who had never once considered slowing down, lending his voice to animated films and children's television, and eventually returning, in altered form, to the character he had made his own over the course of 3 seasons. Mark Goddard, who had played the ship's pilot, and who had been privately warned that the show might be difficult to escape professionally, eventually left the industry behind and built a second career as an educator, working with children who required specialized support. The work was quieter and less visible than anything he had done on television, and by his own account considerably more meaningful. The 3 Robinson children, who were still alive as recently as early 2026, Bill Mumy and Angela Cartwright and Marta Kristen, have continued to find their way back to each other across the decades in a manner that suggests the bonds formed on that soundstage were not merely professional. Mumy and Cartwright, who grew up side by side through their entire adolescence on the Lost in Space set, shared a closeness that matured through various forms over the years and settled into a friendship of genuine depth and duration. They have written together, appeared together, and been photographed together, laughing in ways that suggest the shared experience of having grown up inside that strange and difficult and ultimately remarkable production left a mark that 60 years of ordinary life did not erase. The Netflix reboot that aired from 2018 to 2021 found a way to honor what had come before that was both elegant and affectionate. The rebooted antagonist was given a name that combined the first names of Lockhart and Harris, a quiet acknowledgement from writers who understood what those 2 people had contributed to the original. Mumy appeared in the pilot episode. Cartwright appeared in the 2nd season. And Lockhart, at the age of 96, provided her voice for the series, carrying into a new century the warmth and precision that had made her the emotional center of the show in the first place. She died in October of 2025, at 100 years old, peacefully, having lived long enough to see what she had been part of be canceled and derided, and then slowly, persistently recognized as something that had genuinely mattered. She had never made her peace with learning about the cancellation from a newspaper, but she had made something better than peace with it. She had made a life that continued to carry the show forward with grace and generosity long after anyone had any obligation to. That is what the Robinson family actually was, underneath the foam rubber and the spray paint, and the extraordinary spectacle of Jonathan Harris inventing a character in real time while the cameras rolled. It was a group of people who, given every reason to walk away, kept showing up for each other instead. The Jupiter 2 never made it home. The people who flew it never stopped trying.